Well, hello everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our webinar series that is continuing. I am continuing to let folks into the session. If you are, depending on what view you're looking at on your screen as people join, if you hear my voice but you don't see me, I'm Kevin Bielmeyer, the Economic Development Director for the Town of Southbury, and you have tuned into a Southbury COVID-19 webinar. And this particular one today is focused on the economic disparities of COVID-19 on the Black community. And joining me today as a special guest is Mr. Sean Rochester. And I'll leave this screen and go back and show Sean. Hi, Sean.
Hey, Kevin, how you doing?
Good. I appreciate you joining me. This is real exciting to have you with us. Just to tell everybody a little bit about Sean, if you didn't already know. Sean is a Southbury resident. Let me start there because not everybody might not know the connection here with a Southbury webinar, but he is a resident. So that's a happy find when I came across Sean and learned of him and found out that Sean is the CEO of Good Steward LLC and is the founder of PhD Enterprises and the IDEA Institute. He's also the author of the best-selling book, The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. He's a sought-after speaker, so we're happy that we caught up with him today. He's spoken on Wall Street, Silicon Valley, leading universities, the United Nations, on the topic of the staggering financial cost of discrimination against Black people in America and a new economic framework to help create millions of jobs and businesses that are missing in the Black community. So we welcome him today. Thanks for joining us, Sean.
Kevin, thank you very much for the opportunity to be on the platform and for us to have, an engaging dialogue about a really important topic.
So before we launch into this topic, I just wanted to preface it with some stats, just to kind of give you an idea why we're specifically talking about this today. So here's a few stats for our listeners and watchers. A recent study out of the University of California, the number of Black business owners in the United States dropped by 41% between February and April to 640,000. as compared to a 17% drop in the number of white business owners. And obviously this window of time is COVID-19, which we're in the midst of right now. According to the US Census, Black business owners are underrepresented, making up about 7% of the 15 million small business owners who were working in February before the coronavirus pandemic hit, as compared to more than 13% of the population that they occupy as of 2019. So you can just see the disparity there. That's pre-coronavirus. The Federal Reserve survey showed that Black-owned businesses also had fewer resources to fall back on when the pandemic struck. Some 21% were financially distressed at the end of 2019 based on their profitability, credit score, and earnings, as compared to 5% of white-owned businesses. And the Brookings Institute said that long-standing wealth disparities leave Black entrepreneurs with fewer funds to fall back on during the downturn. Typical Black family had a net worth of $17,150 in 2016, a tenth of the $171,000 held by white families. So just a little bit of data there. And with that, these are sort of stats at the moment, but by no means, particularly in your research, anything that is surprising. And as we look at the pandemic and the impact on the Black community specifically today, safe to say this wasn't just created in an instant. Learning how we got here and informing our listeners of the situation takes some context, and that's why I wanted to have you here today, as that is your specialty. So with that, I want to hand it over to you, Sean, and help us with that context.
Yeah, so one of the things that's important to understand is how we define or take a look at what we mean by here, right? And I tend to look at it from like an economic perspective. So if you're thinking about it from an economic perspective, then after 400 years of being in this place that we call America, Black Americans have about 2% of U.S. wealth, right? Which is an extraordinarily low amount relative to the population. So the question now has to be like how is that possible, right? Because either there is something that is consistently and significantly inept about how we're operating, right, from an economic standpoint, or there's something else going on in the environment that's actually leading to that type of outcome, right? And that's one of the things that I explore in the book, right? The Black tax, the cost of being Black in America. What I try to do is help people understand, like, how could you get into that position in the first place in a country that's, the greatest country in the world and the greatest wealth per capita and the most amount of upward economic mobility, so on and so forth. So, one of the things that we have to look at is I go back from like the time of slavery and I talk about the economic aspect of it, right? I don't get into a description of the horrors of it per se. And there's many things that you could never really value about that period, but you can look at the economic value of the labor extracted from millions of people over a 246 year period, right? Which is roughly a quarter of a millennia. And those numbers are extraordinarily large, right? On the high end, some economists put that number at 24 trillion, right? Some put it as high as 97 trillion. If you assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, you're talking about, around $50 trillion extracted that you're never able to participate in. And even if that number is like new, right, and kind of hard to digest, you can also go back to like 1860 and look at the value of the people held in bondage at that time, right? Because they represent the most liquid asset in the country. They're traded on open markets, right? There's a price if you're old or young, male, female, able-bodied, or lame. So when you look at the value of those folks, it turns out to be so large that you have to measure it in terms of national wealth or national income or GDP. So if you look at it from a wealth perspective, they say it's somewhere between 16 and 20% of US wealth. So if you put that in today's dollars, pre-COVID, US wealth was roughly 85 trillion. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. If you take an average of that, you're at 15.5. Huge number. The other mode that they say you can look at to value it is in terms of national income. So it's about estimated to be 1 to 2 years of national income. So if you look at pre-COVID, national income or GDP is about 19 trillion, right? So you're talking about between 19 and 38 trillion. Take an average of that, you're at 28.5. If you take an average of those two modes, that's going to put you at around roughly $22 trillion. If you go back to 1839, Henry Clay is arguing in the US Senate about what the value of people held in bondage is during that time. And he puts that number at $1.2 billion, right, at that time. If you look at the return on slave-related investments, it's 5 to 7 or 6 to 7% if you look at Thomas Piketty. So if you bring that number forward in today's equivalent, you're at over 24 trillion. And if you say to yourself, well, who's Henry Clay? Who's that guy? He's nobody. He actually is somebody, right? Then we can go back to the 1810s and we can look at what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are saying about the value placed on those people. And they're saying it's roughly about 1 year of GDP, which in today's equivalent would be roughly 19 trillion dollars pre-COVID. Right. Or they said it would be the equivalent of selling 1/3 of all public land, right, in the nation. So the point there is you're talking about really massive, numbers that are hard to comprehend, right? In financial terms, that's the net present value of all of the revenue and profit that those people are going to be generating on a go-forward basis, right? All of those valuations bring you back to about $22 trillion, right, at that point. So it's a gargantuan, amount. And then if you think about, well, what transpired after emancipation, right? Because that period was, a quarter of a millennia. It was horrific, right, in many ways, but it came to an end, right? And folks had a fresh start. And the problem is you had a short period of Reconstruction, which we've all, heard and read about, but then that's followed by this, 75-year nightmare. That's this Jim Crow infrastructure, in which people are returned to a form of labor in which they're receiving basically like 100% tax on their labor. They're really capturing no return based on it.
Dive into that a little bit further for us, Sean, when you say 100% tax and yielding no return on that.
Yeah, so let me do that, because it sounds reckless, right? It sounds like I'm being hyperbolic. Clearly, these people were impoverished, right? But 100% tax sounds a little hyperbolic. So let's talk about it a little bit. So folks came out of bondage with no economic resources. We know there was a discussion about 40 acres and a mule and all those kinds of things, right? But that never came to pass. So what happens is you've got those large mega plantations. Those are broken into smaller lots, and then Black families settle on those lots, and they agree via contract, it's an actual contract, to plant cash crops, and at the end of the season to share in a portion of the crops. Sounds pretty good, right? So that's literally where the term sharecropping comes from. But the problem is all the terms and conditions are set by that white farmer, right? And those people came out of bondage with no economic resources. So for them to get, food, clothes, shelter, the fertilizer, the feed, the tools, they have to be given those things by that white farmer on credit at rates up to 70% per year. So effectively, they're setting your cost structure, right? Now, the rub is when you actually take the crops to market, the white farmer is the market. He tells you what they're worth. So if a person sets your cost structure and they also set your revenue, your income, by definition, they're setting your profit. So you can see where this kind of 100% tax type of thing comes in.
The profit ends up being zero, basically.
Exactly. And frequently it would wind up being negative, because they would not want you to go to another person who might be more generous, right? So it would make your expenses larger than your revenue. It would be negative, and then they would roll that over into the next years. So now you're into perpetual debt servitude, right? And the point there is, how do you accumulate wealth under those conditions, right? Even to cover for today, you don't effectively. So that becomes part of the challenge when it's coming into the accumulation of wealth, because you have a massive amount that's extracted, during that legal period of slavery, and then you have this pseudo period of slavery, in which massive amounts of resources are also being extracted, right? And that's happening for like another 75 years up until the late 40s. Some people say that's continued right up into the 60s. Right. So it's very difficult to accumulate wealth under those resources, and then you have to compound that with the maldistribution of resources in the educational area, right? Through this kind of whole separate but equal framework, which we all know was a fallacy, right? For every dollar invested in a white child, for a Black child, you had $5 to $8 invested in a white child, right? You don't need rocket science to figure that one out, right? One of your kids is going to go to Harvard, the other one's going to be a pauper if you do those kinds of things within your own family. But that was done over a 90-year period, right? For millions of people. So it's tough to accumulate, economic resources. And it's also extremely difficult to build up what we call now the human capital, right? Our know-how. And our capabilities during that period of time. So it's the legacy of those things, in addition to others, right, that we could talk about as well, that's made it extremely difficult to accumulate wealth, particularly in proportion with population and with capability.
And then as we move forward and continue on in through history, and obviously some things get better, but many things don't and perpetuate. When you take us into sort of the 20th century, let's say, and see how the disparity continues to play out in different ways, really right up until the 21st century. But sort of take us into the post-World War II. I know we talked a little bit about earlier offline about the 1950s and the American dream.
So what you have is a period where the middle class is being created, right? And it's one of the things that is uniquely powerful, right, about the United States of America. You have a massive investment that was made in creating what they call the property middle class, which is generally a new phenomenon, right? So, and part of that is starting. I mean, you've clearly got the Homestead Act, where you give away 246 million acres, right, to 1.5 million white families. But then you also, coming out of the Great Depression, you have a massive capital infusion from the New Deal, right? And in the New Deal, you're doing things like setting kind of the maximum length of the work week, the length of the work day. You're putting resources into the farmers. You're allowing labor unions to organize legally, right? And you're also creating Social Security, or what they called old age insurance. But even in the deployment of those resources, less than 2% of Black Americans, benefit from those. And researchers go back, and for that to pass Congress, you had to have two very important exclusions. The first was they had to exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers. And guess what? About 70% of Black people were engaged in, right, at the time. The second thing that they wanted was local administration, right, to the disbursement of the funds. So you can quickly eliminate 70% of the population with that. And then plus you can take care of the other 30% on a local basis. So what research says is that exclusion cost Black people about $146 billion in today's dollars, right, alone. And then that kind of gets compounded with the GI Bill, which was a phenomenal investment, and the 60 million soldiers that were returning from doing a phenomenal job in World War II.
Sure.
But the challenge is less than 2% of those resources went to Black soldiers. And those resources were investment in education, investments in job training, and a subsidization for houses, right? Which is necessary and important and critical, particularly for people who made that level of sacrifice. But you've got a segment of the population, 1 million Black soldiers that participated, right? In World War II. They
didn't get the advantage of the GI Bill, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly, right? Less than 2% of those resources went to those soldiers. So, and these are things, if you think about being able to participate in real estate, right? The largest kind of appreciation of an asset that's happened in like the history of mankind, you're effectively not able to participate. So if you look at the period 1929 to 1969, less than 1% of all mortgages in the United States of America went to Black people, right?
That's staggering.
Yeah, so it's difficult to participate if you're not allowed to actually participate, right? How do you accumulate the wealth, right, under those circumstances that allows you to fund business startup, that allows you to fund, going off to university, or that allows you to fund the purchase or reacquiring of another property, for example, right? And then the intergenerational wealth transfers. So this level of investment, it's about $4 trillion in today's equivalent that was pumped in, subsidized, right, into the middle class, right, from these different vehicles, where you have very little, participation of Black families and Black business interests associated with it.
And
was it extremely difficult?
And was it, in your research, the lack of participation due to lack of accessibility or knowledge, or by design?
So when you say participation, like
like you said, to take advantage, you said like less than 1%, during that period of mortgages, went to the Black owners. But going back to things like the GI Bill and those, the resources that were pumped into our economy to really embolden the middle class. And when everybody thinks of the 1950s, and you think of the big giant cars, and everyone having a house, and just all the things that got developed in the American dream during that period. And as you're saying, there was a very much of an absence of that for the Black community, and whether that is, like I said, by design, or whether these resources were all available technically, but there were prohibitive things making it unavailable.
Yeah, so let's talk about the housing. Like, generally, most people are aware of kind of redlining, right? So, the federal government created the mortgage as we know it, right? And the way that they did it was by subsidizing the payments, right? So if you defaulted, the federal government would pick it up. Right. That reduced the risk for banks. So that allowed banks to take lower deposits, 20%. It allowed for them to lower the interest rate because you're less risky. and it allowed for them to extend the repayment time out to the 30 years. It's the form that we kind of know now. But you had federal policy that did not do that for Black Americans, right? And it would not do it for Black Americans that were trying to move into white communities. So, and even for developers, if they wanted to include, and many intentionally excluded Black people, they couldn't be, they wouldn't get underwriting by the government for their projects, right? And the banks, followed suit. And then you also had, realtors participated by saying they wouldn't participate in those transactions. And they even required covenants, right, in the deeds that says if you sold this home from this community, you would only sell it to a person of European or kind of Caucasian descent. So it's a total phalanx, right? So, and the biggest challenge is you have actual people who can afford the homes, right? And they're being denied the opportunity to participate, which is extraordinarily difficult. And then when you go back to things like GI Bill, the vast majority of Black people are living in the South at that time, right? And there is massive levels of discrimination across the country. It's particularly intense, right? And also violent. There are people who are being hung from trees, right, at this point in time. Right. The very idea that Black people and white people would make the same amount of money, the idea of a minimum wage, and they're both making the same, or even to have social interaction, I mean, it was completely different. And the reason that they wanted local administration, because then that affects or it impacts your ability to effectively discriminate. You just get to say no to the person and they have no recourse, right? Or little recourse. So I'll give you like a kind of anecdotal type of thing. Because I was giving a talk, I was talking with kind of the deacons of a church, right? And the trustees about a similar thing. And one of them who was, a business owner, he was like, oh man, I remember this, right? He was like, my dad fought in World War II, right? And he came back and he was trying to get the resources associated with GI Bill and he couldn't, right? In every office that he went to, he would be denied. And he said in the final office that he went to, after he had been denied and he was leaving, the person who was doing his paperwork asked him, which company did you say that you were a part of or platoon? And he kind of paused and just told him, what that company or platoon was. And the guy was like, oh my goodness, you guys saved our lives, right? Come back and have a seat. And then he filled out all the paperwork, right? And then he was able to get, access to those resources, which is a blessing for him personally. Sure. But he had to be in a situation where his platoon was responsible for saving this person's life for him to get what the law said that he should get in the first place. And what his and many others sacrifice, right. So you've got a very different, very hostile, right, environment that is acting in ways that is extremely economically detrimental, right, for Black people, and it is intentional, right. This is not happening because of happenstance by any stretch of the imagination.
So, Sean, I want to get to some of the other findings in your research, and also, obviously, also the topic at hand of COVID-19 and the current pandemic state. But some of the things that I found particularly illuminating that I think are very informing for our audience, and I found it for myself, are things like, and again, this is kind of jumping more to even today, but things like your example that you gave of the resume example. I love that example where how even today things are viewed through a lens, and some of these are why some of the barriers still exist.
Right. So great example. One of the things that I talk about in the book, and I encourage people to think about and be aware of, is that there are actually quite high levels of anti-Black bias today. Right. I know many people think that we're kind of in a post, particularly pre-COVID and pre-George Floyd. Many people thought we were in a post kind of racial environment. We should be on a different terrain. But there's a ton of research that's been done about the levels of anti-Black bias that exists, right, in the electorate and in the population as a whole. And it's extraordinarily high. Some put it, above 50%. And work that Harvard has done for the people that have taken their online implicit association test where they measure subconscious bias puts that number as high as
I'm going to share that link a little later.
Right. It's a great thing to do, to take before engaging in discussions about these kind of things, right? To see where our own levels are. But that number is close to 7 in 10, right? So these are really, really high levels. The issue becomes, okay, so what? It becomes like, how does it manifest itself in a way that has an economic impact? So the University of Chicago wanted to take a look at, discrimination in the labor market. So they created these resumes, thousands of them, sent them out to jobs of all kinds and sizes, right? Small, large, private, public sector, so on and so across multiple industries. And what they did was they had the resumes increase in quality. So some would have, stronger educational institutions, deeper experience, more robust experience, so on and so forth. But what they would do is they would change the name on the resumes, right? Some would have a black sounding name, right? Some would have a white sounding name. And then they would send out the resumes and they'd wait to see what happened. So what they observed was a couple things. First, for the same exact resume, if it had a black sounding name, same exact resume, no differences, right? You 50% less callbacks from these various firms, right? And which is a tremendous differential, because you don't even get a chance to say how you could be a great candidate and the culture and you could make impact on that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's off the table, right? The other thing that they observed is they said, okay, well, as we increase the quality of the resume, strength of the institution, depth of experience, so on and so forth, what happens to the callback rate? So if you have a white sounding name, it goes up 30%, which makes total sense because it seems like a stronger candidate. Of course, you want to talk to that candidate, right? If you have a black sounding name, no statistical difference. So as you increase the strength of the resume, right, no more incremental interest. Turns out you need like 8 years of incremental interest to overcome that hurdle, right?
8 years of experience, right?
Yeah.
To overcome the difference between just switching the name.
The perception, right, in the name. And that's how bias is playing itself out, right? And some of these things, if you didn't see it from the research and it wasn't such an extraordinary amount of it, you would say this can't be real, right? Like this doesn't make sense. You're clearly being sensitive about this issue and bring in race where race doesn't belong,
right?
And then you see this showing up in the evaluation of work product, right? So same work product by attorneys, for example, if the perception is that this is by a black attorney versus a white attorney, they'll find 100% more errors in it, right? It's very interesting. And then, of course,
the same work, but just evaluating it based on who did the work.
Very different way. Yeah, even in Harvard and Yale did a study on eBay on baseball cards, and what they found was a 20% differential when the card was being sold by a black person. Makes no sense whatsoever. Same card. Makes no sense whatsoever, right? Like that defies all kinds of stuff we were taught about in economics and free market capitalism and all that kind of stuff, right? But here's the challenge. And then more importantly, you would say, how would they know that it was a black person?
Right.
Right, even if it existed. So what they did was, which was very clever, is when they took a picture of the baseball card, they just included the tips of the fingers that were holding the card. So it was enough for the person to see the melanin differential and allow the existing bias to actually play out, right? And that showed up in an economic way, impact in terms of the price that was offered for it, right? So if you think about how that seems very irrational, right? And it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you think about how that plays out in a business, like who can afford a 20% swing, right, and top line in terms of like the marginal impact, right? Very few businesses can absorb that. So these things kind of play out again and again and again, right? And then the issue becomes, how does it also play out in healthcare? How does it also play out in the criminal justice system, right? How does it also play out in housing, right? How does it also play out in zoning, right? Of where industrial facilities are going to be and what the environmental ramifications of that is going to be for that local community and what that has in terms of health implications and so on and so forth.
Well, before we sort of get to some of the solutions, some of the recommendations that you have that you also talk about in your book and also in the work that you do, Just to kind of bring it back to the moment with COVID-19, it's clear in the data that we're seeing, some of the which I shared earlier, that for folks that just joined me did not necessarily see, but there is this greater disparity in the impact of this pandemic on the Black community, and there's a variety of reasons, which I think we should probably touch on today, so that people understand when they hear that statistic and why that is, because I think it gave me an opportunity to have this discussion, because it really is it's all intertwined and tied to economics.
Yep.
And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is because, as you have stated, it's like this isn't a feel subject. Obviously, there is a lot of strong feelings around this, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about nuts and bolts data, and it's economics. So, even something as terrible as this pandemic is, and it's obviously affecting everyone, but why is there this greater disparity?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. One is when you have I try to focus on the economics, right, of everything. You know what I mean? So if you want a healthy, thriving community, you've got to have a healthy, thriving business infrastructure, right, with high unemployment levels, and lots of liquidity available to fund all of that, right, for businesses and consumers.
Right.
When you your physical health is actually proportional generally to the amount of wealth that you and your community have, right? So when you start thinking about, okay, you have disproportionately impact on Black communities, right? Part of that is what they talk about, these underlying comorbidities, which is you have underlying health issues that make you even more susceptible to this particular virus, right? So part of it is because of the density of the communities that you are living in, right? And then part of it is based on the jobs, the fields of occupation that you are part of. All of that is hyper exposing you to the virus for it to play out in nefarious ways. So when you start thinking about, well, why would you have a disproportionate level of comorbidities, right? So part of it is if you go back into the FHA and the housing and the zoning that's associated with it, you've got 6 million people, Black people fleeing, right, basically, which is terror of the South, right, and executions into northern cities. You've got a corresponding white flight out of those cities, right, because they don't want to be in those places. You don't have the capital that you need to move in communities that have greater resources, so you're hyper concentrated into these communities, which are much more dense and starved of economic resources. You also have zoning practices that are happening that are zoning industrial areas closer to those areas, right? So, and that's affecting the air quality within those communities, and it's also affecting contaminants in the soil and contaminants in the water, which is why you start to see issues of infant mortality disparities. You see issues associated with respiration, right? You see asthma and the like, right? And you see other issues associated with that, right? Plus you have the hyper concentration of stress associated with being in impoverished communities, right? Sure. Poverty doesn't make anything better. You know what I mean? I know people like, money is not important. That's
only people with money say that.
Exactly. Being without resources doesn't make anything better, right? It doesn't make relationships better. It doesn't make education better. It doesn't make anything better, right? So you have the additional issues. Plus, you also have the issues associated with diet and the food disparities, right, that are available to those communities. They're all emanating from this architecture that's coming out, that's being propelled by this kind of discriminatory, behavior. So, and then it's compounded now by, you had a movement, industry used to be in inner cities, right?
Right.
And then it moved out of inner cities, then eventually a bunch of it moved offshore. But that left communities, that increased joblessness in those communities, because you don't have the economic mobility to kind of follow those, to follow those jobs or move to better places. Right. So that also puts additional stress, right, on wealth. The other part of the challenge is if you look at the first 50 years, right, of like the 20th century, if you look at Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination, he says during that period of time, you have no increase in economic mobility or relative difference between white occupations and black occupations, right? So you open more factories, you got more black janitors, right? You don't have more black managers and, you know, tool and die people and all that kind of stuff. So you're not moving up very much on a relative basis.
Right.
And that's placing you in kind of the lower skilled areas, which means you're less likely to be in a kind of white collar area. You're less likely to be in a type of role that's higher income where you can work from home. I'm very blessed to be able to be work from home, right? There's many people who do not have, you know, that opportunity. Those things make, you know, health outcomes much worse because the type of job you have can affect the type of healthcare you have. And by the way, not having a job affects, and obviously the unemployment rates are so much higher, have been that case for so long, it dramatically affects, you know, the type of healthcare and health outcomes that you will have. And that doesn't even really go into the disparities we see in the providing of the healthcare. Right.
So the healthcare system itself and the accessibility to it.
Exactly. Right. So it adds to hyper concentrate the likely outcome. So McKinsey and Company, right, had been doing studies looking at the economics of Black communities and whatnot. And then they did studies looking at the impact of COVID-19 on those communities. And what they're saying is, you know, you could basically overlay the disparate impact on the economics of the communities. Right? The communities are hyper susceptible to it. You've got low amounts of economic resources. You've got significant, you know, the unemployment. You've got close, high concentration or close quarters, right, of people. And then you've got a high concentration of kind of lower paid jobs that are deemed as essential, right? So your likelihood to be in contact with the virus is higher. Your likelihood for the virus to impact you in a far more negative way, right, is higher. And then your likelihood to get access to the healthcare that can help you, or proper healthcare, is a lot lower. So it's an aggregation of very negative circumstances that are leading to this very disparate, you know, impact.
And I think that this moment, you know, taking the social moment aside and the violence and everything else, but just this coronavirus moment, you know, that we're in, has served to throw a spotlight on some of these things. You know, seeing the numbers and the data that comes out and showing, you know, like I just heard this morning a report similar to what we're talking about here, talking about the Latino community, and they said, you know, right now we're in a case where there's 40,000 new COVID cases every day. CDC is saying that may go as high as 100,000 a day if things continue on the route we're on now. And 26% of the folks that have perished from COVID-19, 26% come from the Latino community. So, you know, there are some of these factors that are contributing to the disparity with the Black community exist in other minority communities as well, as I'm indicating by that figure. So we're by no means suggesting, you know, that it's solely, you know, the Black community that has this disparity. What's different, though, and both in your research and talking to you and diving into this a bit, is some of the factors that, you know, some of which you've covered already, that have led to this situation. Some of, you know, the outcomes are somewhat the same because of the disease, but why it's affecting some of them are the same things, like you know, jobs and eligible workers, et cetera. But some of the root causes are not the same. You know, there's definitely unique properties here at play economically within the Black community. Just in, you know, going back to the history as you've told it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, it's not binary. It's not, you know, are Black people impoverished or not, or economically disadvantaged or not, versus another group, right? There is the degree, the scale, and the kind associated with it, right? You can find disparity in any group, for sure, right? But you have a unique series of aspects when it comes to, like, you know, Black Americans. And that's without question. Yep.
So I want to get to some of the work that you've been doing. I know some of the questions that I had asked you, which lead into that, are, how do we move forward? At each point, it seems to get a little bit better. Certainly, I mean, we're arguably in a better spot today than we were in the Jim Crow era, and better than the Civil War, et cetera. Hopefully we're improving, albeit slowly. But what can be done today? And this goes for not only the Black community itself, what it can do for itself to help one another, but also just everybody across the community. And before we dive into that, I do want to say that some may say, well, why are we talking about this in Southbury? It's a very undiverse, let's say, community. So why would this even be a topic of interest, so to speak? And both in terms of the participants that have joined us and those that will watch this in the replay, I think there is a great deal of interest, and as there should be, because by the sheer nature of this community not being extremely diverse by any stretch of the imagination, means a lot of these things don't get talked about, and getting into the weeds on some of these issues is not water cooler conversation, arguably in the town of Southbury. So to throw it back, what are some of the, quote unquote solutions or things, positive, proactive things that can be done?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I think is really important to just make sure that we become, educated and informed about these matters, right? Very often people approach these conversations and they just want to affirm their position, right? They have strong positions, they have a lot of passion, they have very little information and even less context associated with it. So part of, the work with the Black tax and the talks and, all the lectures and the whatnot is a part of educating people, right? Just so we can put things in context, right? So when we say better relative to what, you know what I mean? So relative to hanging on trees, absolutely. You know what I mean? Yeah. But if you go back to 1870, Black people own 0.17% of US wealth. If you go into the 50s, that's about 1%. If you go to now, it's about 2%, right? And you can look at the detail, by income level. You know what I mean? And the only portion is the 90th percentile, right? They've increased quite a bit, the 50th, 75% haven't. So that context is really important. But what I like to focus on is like the economic aspects of things, right? Because there's many different issues where people can focus on, right? But for me, it's the economic aspect. So I'm like, listen, prior to COVID, the Black community was missing about 6 million jobs across the broader community, right? That's a huge issue. We're missing about 1.4 million jobs with employees, right? Those the bigger jobs associated with them, right? So there's about 2.56 million Black businesses in America, at least there were pre-COVID, right? But only 4% of those have any employees. And that 4% generates 70% of the revenues, about $100 billion, and employs 1 million people. You know what I mean? But we're missing 1.4 million of those. And those two things is driving this massive wealth gap that we're seeing, which is in the trillions. So I talk about this economic framework that's called PHD, purchase, hire, and deposit, in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital, right, or liquidity in the Black community, right? We cannot have the type of thriving communities that we want when you have a gap of employment, right? When you have a gap of thriving business infrastructure, and when you have a gap in liquidity. It's just not possible, and it doesn't exist anywhere. So that becomes a matter of, what can people do as individuals? What can corporations and institutions do, right? And then what can you do from like a much larger policy standpoint, right? So, and the economic framework is the same, right? Is it creating jobs? Is it, are we properly represented on people's payroll, right? And typically, part of what my research saw or found was that in areas that are critical for wealth accumulation for Black Americans, we tend to hover around a 2% participation rate, right? So if you look at corporate supply chain spend, it's like 2% is with Black enterprise, right? If you look at government supply chain spend at all levels, local, right, state and federal, it's like 2%. You know what I mean? Even if you look at the spend amongst, African Americans, it's about 2%. is being spent on the businesses. That's a very negative impact in terms of demand for Black enterprise. So, and you can have a big impact on that by utilizing more of those businesses in your supply chain, right? Whether you're, a town or a university or a corporation or, state or federal government. You can create tens of thousands of jobs by including, businesses in there. The second thing, in almost all high growth, high compensation fields, we tend to have this kind of 2% representation when you think about technology space, right? When you think about many STEM careers, right? Things that have intergenerational earning capabilities, right? Cover the cost of today, have something left over, right, for future generations. Participation rate tends to be really low. And then the other piece of it is being able to provide capital or liquidity. If you look at SBA funding, less than 2%, so 1.6% of it was going to Black enterprise, right? SBA is putting a lot of capital out, right? These businesses are getting almost none of it, right? So what are the things that we can do to be more stimulative in that way? And then how do you evaluate the efficacy of a policy, program, or strategy? And for me, it's very simple. Is it creating a job, right? Is it creating or expanding business, right? Are you providing liquidity? And now you have the ability to come up with different plans and programs that might affect that. So you see that I believe it's Netflix just announced that they're going to take, eventually 2% of their cash on hand and put it into Black financial institutions, right? It's only about, or Black banks, I think is what they specifically use. So only about 19 of those. And Black banks have, I think the number is $4 out of every $10,000 in the US banking system is in a Black bank. There's almost no ability to actually finance yourself in a non-kind of discriminatory way. So Netflix announced they're going to start off with $100 million and put them in those institutions, which is great because they provide liquidity in Black communities, right? And they provide lending for Black enterprise. And they all go together because as a business owner, which, you and many people, that are on with us know, your dream contract can bankrupt you, right? Because you've got to deploy all the capital up front, all the working capital, long before you get the payment. And those payment dates are much more long dated if you're using a government, right, as your off-take partner. So you actually need access to capital to be able to deliver on that. So in addition to increasing the demand in the supply chain, right, and then you also need to make sure that the liquidity is available. And we can do that as individuals just by, where we spend our money, how we spend our money, right? You buy a car, is there a Black dealer around, right? None of us have ever gotten a small bill when we went to an auto dealer, right? Because they're terrific jobs, you know what I mean? 66 people work there, and it's phenomenal job from the top to the bottom, and it's highly skilled, right? There's 16,000 auto dealers in America pre-COVID, right? But only 264 were Black. Like, imagine that. In the whole country, right? And those are phenomenal, terrific paying jobs. And Black people buy about 5 million cars a year, right? So you're talking about tens of billions of dollars, right? Close to $90+ billion that are being spent that could have huge stimulative impacts if you kind of apply it, And these are the kinds of things, right, that I encourage people to do. As is there an opportunity to engage these enterprises to buy from them, right? Or is there an opportunity to make sure that we're employing people relative, in our payroll, right? And can we provide liquidity for businesses in the Black community? And I'm all communities need resources, capital, and so on and so forth. I'm speaking specifically to the Black community because the levels of bias are quite high, right? And they're very resistant to change, right? The rate at which it diminishes from year to year is actually quite low relative to everyone else. So you need to be intentional when it comes to that. Right,
intentional is the operative word there, and I think that as you look at each of those areas, to your point, it's just intentionally seeking to not do business as usual, and to look at
and by the way, if you're a capitalist, right? Discrimination is horrible for business. Right. it's terrible for capital, right? I mean, Gary Becker established a long time ago that both the discriminator and the discriminated pay a price to engage in discrimination. You know what I mean? What you're doing is you're not adding the brilliance of other populations, right, into the team, right, or into the business infrastructure or into the creative process. And if you think about this innovation process that happened during that Jim Crow, was also one of the most important parts of the Industrial Revolution. 2.5 patents were filed in the United States, right? 726 were from Black people, almost a complete exclusion of Black talent and prowess from that innovation process. Imagine if it had been included. Exactly. Right.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that or writing about that, about the, that being inclusive isn't just a matter of, help out, the Black community and what can we do to help out, but it's like, it's good business to be inclusive, to bring all the ideas to the table, all the talents to the table. And now you have a choice that's far greater of candidates, whether it's for a job or, like you said, a patent. And why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want, if you seek to have the very best, let's include everybody to the table to put forth their idea or their skill set, and have that additional very large group of talent at your fingertips.
Yeah, it's important that people understand that the underlying principle is that talent, skill, capability follows a normal distribution, right? Fancy way of saying across all population ethnicity, 70% of the people are average or good. 15% are well above average. I call it the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're part of that group, right? And then 15% are substantially below. So what you're doing, right, if you're acting in an exclusive way, is you're excluding that brilliance, right? What you're doing when you're acting in an exclusive way is you're bringing that brilliance onto the team, right, or into the infrastructure. And that's super critical. And, in decades and in years past, that was not the underlying assumption, right, that they took. They thought talent was hyper aggregated in a particular group, so you exclude the rest of them. But it's actually cost you significant amounts of money. There's brilliance in Compton, right? There's brilliance in South Side of Chicago. There's brilliance in Ferguson. The issue is the resources aren't there for that brilliance to be developed, right? So that now we can deploy it according to its ability, and that's once you start to see things differently, you're like, oh, okay, you start to see a cost shifting to an investment, right? Yeah.
So Sean, I want to try to get to, we only have a few minutes left, and I know we got a lot of questions that have poured in, so I'm going to jump over to those, if I may, and see if we can answer a few. Actually, I got a few here from Ed. Ed, do you want to unmute and ask it directly? It's your choice, or I can go ahead and read it.
Well, you can go ahead and read it, Kevin. You're doing a great job.
All right. So this says, I'd like to add to Sean's concise history of post-World War II economic policies, but we should acknowledge that a town like Southbury is a direct beneficiary of programs such as the Federal Housing Authority mortgages and interstate highways, as well as the GI Bill. And being a beneficiary has allowed white people to leave cities such as Waterbury, our nearest neighbor, and start a new community while leaving minorities behind with the aging infrastructure, pollution, reduced public funding, etc. That was more of a comment, but certainly springboarding what we talked about earlier, Sean. And Ed goes on to say, you can make an argument that Southbury's main business is the elderly. We've got the Heritage Village, Pomfret Woods, the Hearth, etc. Definitely in a large part of our population, a very important part of our population here. To keep these businesses going, we need these essential health workers, health aides that come, in many cases from outside of Southbury, who are then placed at higher risk as a result of close association with people who are more vulnerable to COVID-19. Do we therefore bear a responsibility to help address this disparity because of our need as a community?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is absolutely, right? It's not just Southbury, by the way, right? You had a national white flight out of cities that was underwritten by the U.S. government, right? So these homes, these developers, they were underwritten through the FHA, which was federal policy, right, to discriminate against U.S. citizens, and that's reinforced by actual participants of communities. You have people who are members of the greatest generation, right? They receive extraordinary levels of capital infusion, which I think is a wonderful and a great and a fantastic thing. But you have to be aware that Black citizens were excluded from that, right? By and large, less than 2% of all those resources. So when you look at the data, if you look at, like a Black and white person born between, I think it's, 1943 and like 1952, the white person born at that time would go on to have 11 times more wealth, right, than a Black person born at that time. Right. The story that we're often given is that's just a matter of decisions that you've made and hard work and bootstrapping and things like that. But it's extremely important to understand the level of investment and subsidization that went along with that, the environments that were created to facilitate that, even to connect cities across the country through the national highway construction, right? And to connect inner cities to the suburbs, right? I mean, that was funded by government spend, right? 90% of all that money, right, went for federal government for the interstate highways. And then you had a significant infrastructure development or investment made to facilitate creating kind of, bedroom communities, right? It would say, right? You live one place, you kind of work in another place. And corporations did that too. There's a reason why you have a lot of major corporations that are out in the suburbs, right? They were part of the white flight as well. What the problem is, a lot of people don't know any of this stuff, right? And how would you know it? It's not in the curriculum, right? Unless you go to in the K through 12, unless you go to a really specialized university that's got some unique class, you're not going to really come across it. What you're going to know is what you see and kind of what you hear and the things you interface with from the media. And it doesn't speak to this stuff. So the logical conclusion is, well, it was me, right?
Well, there you are, and you happen to be right here in Southbury. So
Did I just make one observation? And I don't know if I read it in your piece, Sean, but I just came across it recently. When we talk about mortgages and the redlining, even you could get a mortgage, but the difference between an FHA mortgage and a non-FHA mortgage, as I understand it, going back in the late 40s and 50s, you can get a mortgage, but instead of a 30-year term, it would be a 5 or a 10-year term.
Yep.
And instead of 20% down, it would be more like 40%.
Yep.
Those were standard for everyone prior to World War II.
That's right.
Then the federal government came in and said, and I'm a real beneficiary of that, we're going to have a different approach to housing. But as you point out, it only ended up to be, which was a great thing, but it only applied to certain people. That was a terrible thing.
Yeah. What happened is it didn't diminish people's desire to have the American dream and to be a homeowner. It just shifted people into the unregulated markets under something called contract sales, which was draconian, right? Because no appraisal is required. So homes are being sold at 2x the price. You have usury interest rates associated with it. And the most nefarious thing of all is as you make the installment payments, you don't actually accrue any equity in the home. So if you had 100 payments in an installment agreement and you made 99 on time and you missed the 100, they got to keep your down payment. They got to keep your 99. They got to evict you and then resell the house to someone else. And they look and they say in the 50s in the greater Chicagoland area, which was a huge area for Black people moving from the South, up to 85% of all real estate transactions for Black people were under that construct. Like, again, it makes it very difficult to accumulate wealth when you have such predatory, practices, right? And people are trying very hard to actually accumulate wealth from those periods.
So, Sean, I'm going to have to wrap it up. So I want to share some resources here at the end for everyone. One is the Office of Congresswoman Jahana Hayes. They were on the call today. They just had to get off now, and they wanted to let us know that they have continued 100% of our casework and constituent services throughout the pandemic. They continue to serve the constituents virtually by phone. And by the way, anybody that's on this call can look at your group chat and can see these things that I'm noting, so you can jot them down. They have the email contact and phone number contact for the Congresswoman's office. And by all means, welcome anybody to reach out to them if they've got a concern. Also, a little further on down in our chat box, somebody had asked the question, is there a resource for finding Black-owned businesses? And one resource that was noted is, I believe it's your site. So you can see the address there, www.supportblackowned.com/state/CT, as a resource for Black-owned businesses in Connecticut. If folks wanted to make that concentrated, or what was the word you used, intentional, right, effort with which to do business with a Black-owned business. And I just want to jump back to my my presentation here for a second to share with everyone the contact information of, actually, I'm going to share this first. This was the test that Sean spoke to that Harvard did, and it is still available to take, the implicit association test. So there is the website for it, and I'm going to be sending out a recap email to everybody that participated on this with all these links in it. So if you don't have time to jot it down now, you can get it there. But what this is yeah, test your own implicit biases. Most of us, I think, sort of walk around thinking we have zero or be close to none, but we may be surprised if we took this test, what we might find. And then I also wanted to share contact information of Sean and myself. So if you want to have any follow-up conversation or questions asked, or pick up a copy of Sean's book, The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America, there's the website for that as well. And before I let you go, I just want to also do a plug for next week's webinar, which will be on the emotional side of reopening. And we have with us, joining me, Ron Carucci, co-founder and managing partner of Navilant. He's a consultant to CEOs and executive leaders. So he will be joining me for that. And he's also an author as well. And his book is, probably won't show up on the camera here, Rising Power, The Journey of Exceptional Executives. So he's going to be joining me for that. And I just want to thank everybody for participating in this. I know we barely scratched the surface, but most of all, I want to thank Sean for joining me for this conversation. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much for extending the invitation, for great dialogue, both kind of on and off camera. And I appreciate it. Look forward to doing more.
All right. Take care, everybody, and stay safe.